Mr. Narvik, I just want to ask you to answer briefly, but you mentioned in your testimony that as regards life cycle, global greenhouse gas emissions, producing oil and gas out of the Gulf of Mexico for the United States has the lowest greenhouse gas emission profile per unit of energy. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. According to the Wood-Mackenzie study, the only country that was close was Saudi Arabia, and that study did not include transportation of the oil back to the United States. So, but the other importers that we use, Canada in particular, it exposes us to a lot of extra greenhouse gas emissions by importing oil from Canada relative to the Gulf of Mexico.
And I think I know from an Obama-era study that when we add those life cycle costs of transportation to the oil and gas brought in from the oil brought in from Saudi, their emissions profile is worse than ours.
That was stated in a 2016 BOEM report prepared under the Obama administration.
So one more time, if you want to, since we know people are going to be using oil and gas, if you're producing oil and gas out of the Gulf of Mexico, it has the lowest greenhouse gas emission profile of per unit of energy that comes to our shore than any place else that oil and gas comes from in the U.S. or from around the world.
We got to get our oil from the Gulf of Mexico. And, you know, we have talked for decades about economic security associated with domestic production. We've talked about energy security, about the ability for us to control international events because of our production of domestic oil and gas. Now we need to talk about greenhouse gas emissions and producing our oil under tightly regulated environments that allow us to produce the cleanest barrel in the world as we go through this transition.
One more thing, you ready?
Yes, sir.
Now, there's obviously a lot of tension worldwide. How do you create good-paying jobs for wherever you live, but let's say Americans who don't necessarily have an advanced degree? Good people, but they're hardworking, but they don't have a PhD in solar engineering. Looking at your workforce, not the engineers, I'm just talking about the folks that go out to the rig, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. What is the average amount of money they earn?
Yes, Senator, thank you for asking that. We have a wonderful staff of very qualified, technically driven people that work offshore every day in our operations. 200 of them are related to
Fast, man. How much?
Sorry, $100,000. We have
$100,000 for a guy that only has a high school education, but he's hardworking and he's sending his kid off to better schools to have a better future?
Yes, sir.
Wow. We need more of those jobs.
Yes, sir.
Governor,
yes, sir.
Our state was pounded by Katrina. We've been hit by multiple hurricanes since. We need to restore our coastline. Now tell us, if you don't mind, how these dollars leverage BP oil dollars in order to contribute to our coastal restoration plan.
Thank you, Senator. So there are a couple of pots of funding under the BP oil spill settlement that the state of Louisiana benefits from that work on a reimbursement basis. So if we don't have the dollars in the first instance to pay for the project, we don't have a project to be reimbursed for, and that's specifically the NERDA and the NIPWIF pots of funding. So it is important.
So the GOMESA dollars provide that matching sum.
Yes.
And now tell me, how much is our coastal restoration plan over the next 50 years, i.e. the plan to prevent us from having another Hurricane Katrina whack New Orleans? How much does that cost?
It is a minimum of $50 billion.
50 with a B.
Yes, sir.
Ms. Lefton, here we've heard about fantastic jobs, $100,000 for folks who may have a high school education only, but they're great people, and they're getting a better future for their family. We have the lowest emission profile per unit of energy produced hitting our shores than any place in the nation, and it's providing matching dollars to rebuild our coastline. How long will this pause last, and why is it even being considered?
Well, thank you, Senator. As I said in my testimony, we have a responsibility to the American public to review our programs to ensure that they do amount to a fair return to the American taxpayer. So that is exactly what we are doing.
So is the question that we need to raise the royalty payments? I don't quite understand, because right now, onshore gets a far better royalty payments going to the states, less to the federal, and here the federal government's getting more of a reward.
So actually, Senator, I believe you're referring to the revenue sharing.
Correct.
So I think it's critical first to acknowledge that 90% of those revenues are actually coming from royalties. So that means as production continues.
Coming from where?
From royalties. So that means as production continues, which we expect it would, in fact, 55% of the 12 million acres that are under lease in the Gulf of Mexico, we don't even have a plan for yet. 80% of that acreage is not yet currently producing. So there's plenty of opportunity for what is currently.
But that assumes that this pause is going to end in the near term.
No, sir, it doesn't.
Because as we've heard, you chill investment as long as there's this uncertainty going forward.
Well, fortunately, actually, we're still seeing plans come into BOEM, and we are processing those plans.
No,
so
but
that,
not for new
so that
leases, though.
development.
The issue is the new leases.
Well, we would have plans for leasing, right? So there are existing acreage under lease, and then what happens?
What I'm hearing from our oil field service folks is that as long as there's a pause, no one will invest in new capacity. And 250,000 people in our state are directly or indirectly employed in this. Are you committing to us that the administration will once again begin to lease in the Gulf of Mexico?
I'm committing to you, sir, that we will have an interim report that is going to be out in the early summertime, and very glad to continue the conversation.
I'll finish with this. If you're speaking of the American public as 250,000 workers, some of them earning $100,000 with a college degree, including the construction jobs, rebuilding our coastline so we don't get whacked by more hurricanes, that American public says resume leasing. If you're speaking to the American public benefiting from the Great American Outdoors Act, which is rebuilding our nation's parks, or from the Land Water Conservation Fund, which depends on this funding, they are saying resume leasing. I yield back. I'm just frustrated by this kind of inaction. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Several things. First, it's been brought to my attention that per federal law, any revenue derived from GOMESA that distributes to the 4 states in the Gulf has to be used for hurricane protection or to mitigate damages caused by oil and gas development. So Senator Manchin's opening questions to my governor suggested that perhaps some of the other states had not done so. The only thing we've done additionally in Louisiana, we've codified it in our state constitution. But this money in all those 4 states is being used for that environmental purpose. I also want to point that out. Secondly, we speak of, well, Mr. Menarvik, let me ask you. The governor mentioned that demand for oil and gas will remain. Can you briefly tell us what independent statements, nothing against my Democratic governor, we occasionally disagree, but what independent analysis states that there will be at least a constant or growing demand for oil worldwide?
Yeah, I can speak to that. First of all, I'd like to say we've been in business 22 years, and when we started, 75 million barrels of oil was being used in this world every day. And in 2019, it was close to 100 million barrels of oil a day. So there's been a steady and rapid increase in demand from other countries like China and India and others. And the IEA has projected that it's going to be 104 and 105 in the next 5 years, and will continue to set all-time records. That may or may not be the case. I think it is, but we may be wrong. Maybe it will go down. There's a lot of projections out there. But I will tell you that the best place we can get oil is from the U.S. Gulf of Mexico. And because of the economic security, because it puts people to work, because we generate our own royalties and fund all these wonderful programs, and most importantly, I think because it has lower greenhouse gases. We regulate our own oil. If I got a second, I'd like to reference a letter that was sent 3 years ago when oil prices were about the same. 4 Democratic senators sent a letter to President Trump and asked him to pressure OPEC to increase production because it was having impact on the domestic economic conditions. They summarized by saying the current run-up in world oil prices is effectively a tax on every American family's discretionary budget, except that the money goes to OPEC cartel rather than to the U.S. Treasury. Adding to the constituents' pocketbook concerns is their understanding that our nation's continued dependence on oil is at the heart of many of our nation's greatest economic, environmental, and national security challenges. That is exactly right. That is without question. And that's why we need to drill more wells in the Gulf of Mexico.
Let me also point out that it's not just oil and gas is used for transportation, for propulsion. Everything I'm touching right now is a synthetic made from a oil or gas product. The plastic, the synthetics, the carpet that we're sitting upon. If somebody is a member of PETA and they don't want to wear leather, they are wearing something which is derived from oil and gas. And so it is an essential nature. Now, Governor, you mentioned GM's saying that they're only going to use batteries by some date in the future. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit for the record both International Energy Agency report on the role of critical minerals in clean energy transition, and I'd also like to have an editorial from today's Wall Street Journal written by Mark Mills, who came here without
objection.
And in this, it points out that you're going to mine the critical minerals to make these batteries, and that the intensity of environmental despoliation involved with critical minerals and the threat to our national security is quite large. Because one, the United States has almost no footprint where these are produced. They are being produced in nations with poor governance per independent evaluations, which uses a lot of natural resources to produce in an environmentally, shall we say, destructive way, as opposed to oil and gas, which has a very small footprint and in which it is typically governed, at least in the Gulf of Mexico, by environmental standards which are quite strong. We're just replacing one set of mining procedures with another set of mining procedures, one set of environmental concerns with another much larger set of environmental concerns, and secure national security for insecure national security because we're dependent upon other nations. That is from IEA, implied, stated, but in bureaucratese, but it's clearly spelled out in this editorial, which is why I raise it. See if there's one more thing I want to raise. With that, Mr. President, I yield back.